Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished loading the last bale of hay onto the old pickup truck. The late afternoon sun beat down on the family farm that had been her home for all 24 years of her life. Her father had built this place from nothing, and after his death 2 years ago, she had sworn to keep it running no matter what. The farm sat 5 miles outside the small town of Cedar Ridge, Texas. It was isolated enough that Sarah often went days without seeing another soul, but she had never minded the solitude. The rolling fields of corn and wheat, the small herd of cattle, and the vegetable garden near the house were her world. She knew every inch of this land like it was part of her own body. Sarah climbed into the driver's seat of the weathered Ford and started the engine. The truck coughed and wheezed, but finally rumbled to life. She needed to get this hay to the barn before the storm clouds gathering on the horizon opened up. The weather forecast had been calling for severe thunderstorms all week, and she could feel the electricity in the air. As she drove along the dirt road that connected her property to the main highway, Sarah noticed something unusual in her rearview mirror. A cloud of dust was rising from the direction of town, much bigger than what a single car would make. She slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, curious about what could be causing such a disturbance. The sound reached her before she could see what was making it. The deep, throaty roar of motorcycle engines, not just one or two, but many. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, despite the heat of the day. Cedar Ridge was a quiet farming community where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual county fair. Motorcycle gangs were something she had only seen in movies. The first bike appeared over the hill, followed by another, then another. Sarah counted at least 30 motorcycles as they thundered down the highway toward her. The riders wore leather jackets and bandanas, their bikes adorned with chrome and flame decals. Even from a distance, she could see that these were not friendly tourists passing through town. The lead rider spotted Sarah's truck on the side of the road and held up his hand, signaling the group to slow down. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized they were stopping. She quickly tried to start her truck, but the old engine chose that moment to be stubborn. It turned over once, twice, but refused to catch. The motorcycles pulled off the highway and surrounded her truck in a loose circle. The engines shut off one by one, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Sarah kept trying to start the truck, pumping the gas pedal and muttering every prayer she could remember. The leader of the group dismounted his bike and walked toward her truck. He was a large man with a gray beard and arms covered in tattoos. His leather vest bore patches that Sarah didn't recognize, but something about them made her stomach turn. The other riders began getting off their bikes as well, forming a tighter circle around her vehicle. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the leader said, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "Looks like we found ourselves a farm girl." His companions laughed, and the sound sent another chill through Sarah's body. Sarah rolled down her window just a crack. "I'm sorry, but I need to get going. There's a storm coming and I have work to do." The leader grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "No need to rush, sweetheart. We're just passing through looking for a little hospitality. Maybe you could show us around your place?" "I'm afraid that's not possible," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is private property, and I need to ask you to move on." The man's grin faded. "That wasn't really a request, darling." He nodded to his companions, and several of them moved closer to the truck. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this situation. Her cell phone was on the kitchen counter back at the house, and the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Even if she could get the truck started, she was surrounded by motorcycles that could easily outrun her old Ford. "Listen," she said, her voice stronger now despite her fear. "I don't want any trouble. My farm is small, and I don't have anything valuable. Why don't you head into town? The diner there serves good food, and there's a motel if you need a place to stay." The leader laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "Oh, but you do have something valuable, sweetheart. You have yourself." He reached for the door handle of her truck. Sarah slammed her hand down on the lock button, but she knew it wouldn't hold them for long if they really wanted to get in. Through the windshield, she could see more of the bikers moving closer. Some of them were pulling tools from their saddlebags, and their intentions were becoming clear. "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please just leave me alone." But the leader was no longer listening. He was examining the lock on her door, while behind him, his companions were discussing the best way to break the windows without cutting themselves on the glass. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old, but her rifle was locked in the gun cabinet back at the house. Her truck had finally decided to cooperate, but there were motorcycles blocking every possible escape route. The first raindrops began to fall, spattering against the windshield like tears. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving, and Sarah couldn't help but think it was fitting. She had worked so hard to keep her father's farm running, to prove that she could handle anything life threw at her, and now it might all end here on this lonely stretch of road. One of the bikers had found a crowbar and was approaching the passenger side of the truck. Sarah watched in horror as he positioned it against the window, preparing to break the glass. She knew that once they got her out of the truck, her chances of survival would be close to zero. "Stop!" she called out, but her voice was lost in the sound of the wind that was picking up ahead of the storm. The biker with the crowbar looked at his leader, who nodded. Sarah braced herself for the sound of breaking glass, but instead, she heard something else. The distant sound of more engines, different from the motorcycles. These engines had a deeper, more powerful sound, and they were getting closer. The leader of the biker gang heard it too. He held up his hand, stopping his companion with the crowbar. All 35 bikers turned toward the sound, their expressions changing from predatory confidence to concern. Over the hill came 6 vehicles unlike anything Sarah had ever seen on the back roads of Texas. They were military-style trucks, painted in desert camouflage and built for serious work. As they approached, Sarah could see that each truck carried armed soldiers in full combat gear. The lead truck stopped directly in front of the circle of motorcycles, and 6 men emerged from the vehicles with the smooth, coordinated movement of a well-trained unit. They were not large men like the biker leader, but something about the way they carried themselves made them seem far more dangerous than any of the 35 bikers surrounding Sarah's truck. The soldier who appeared to be in command stepped forward. He was of medium height with short-cropped hair and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene at once. Unlike the bikers, he showed no aggression, but there was something in his calm demeanor that suggested violence was always an option he was prepared to exercise. "Gentlemen," the soldier said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "I'm Captain James Rodriguez, and these are my men. We couldn't help but notice that you seem to be having some kind of disagreement with this young lady." The biker leader straightened up, trying to reassert his authority. "This ain't none of your business, soldier boy. We're just having a friendly conversation with the lady here." Captain Rodriguez looked at Sarah's truck, taking in the crowbar near the passenger window and the obvious distress of the woman inside. "Ma'am," he called out, "are these men bothering you?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes," she called back through her partially open window. "They're trying to break into my truck. I've asked them to leave me alone, but they won't listen." The captain nodded slowly. "I see." He turned back to the biker leader. "In that case, I'm going to have to ask you and your friends to mount up and move on. This young lady has made it clear she wants to be left alone." The biker leader's face reddened with anger. "And what if we don't want to move on? There's 35 of us and only 6 of you. Maybe you should mind your own business and keep driving." Captain Rodriguez smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Sir, I appreciate you taking the time to count us. It shows attention to detail. But you might want to consider that sometimes numbers don't tell the whole story. The rain was falling harder now, and lightning flashed in the distance. The wind was picking up, causing the wheat in Sarah's fields to bend and sway like waves on an ocean. The storm was going to be a big one, and everyone present seemed to sense that they needed to resolve this situation quickly. One of the bikers near the back of the group whispered something to his companion, and Sarah caught the words Delta Force carried on the wind. She didn't know much about the military, but even she had heard of Delta Force. They were supposed to be the most elite soldiers in the entire United States Army, the ones who handled the most dangerous missions that no one else could complete. The biker leader had heard the whispered words as well, and for the first time since the motorcycles had stopped, he looked uncertain. But he had gone too far to back down now, especially in front of his followers. "I don't care what fancy unit you think you're from," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We were here first, and we're not leaving until we're ready to leave." Captain Rodriguez nodded as if he had expected this response. "I understand your position, sir, but I need you to understand mine. That young lady is obviously in distress, and my men and I have sworn an oath to protect innocent people from harm. We take that oath very seriously." The captain glanced back at his 5 companions, who had spread out in a loose line behind him. Sarah could see that they were all armed, but none of them had drawn their weapons. Instead, they stood with the relaxed alertness of people who were completely confident in their ability to handle whatever might come next. "So here's what's going to happen," Captain Rodriguez continued. "You and your friends are going to get back on your motorcycles and ride away. The young lady is going to drive safely back to her farm, and everyone is going to go home in one piece. Does that sound like a reasonable plan to you?" The biker leader looked around at his followers, many of whom were now looking decidedly uncomfortable. The mention of Delta Force had clearly shaken some of them, and the calm confidence of the 6 soldiers was having an effect as well. But pride and the momentum of the situation carried him forward. "I told you, soldier boy, we're not going anywhere until we're good and ready, and right now we're not ready." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that made several of the motorcycles' alarms go off. The storm was almost on top of them, and Sarah could feel the electricity in the air making her skin tingle. Captain Rodriguez sighed softly. "Well, sir, I was hoping we could settle this like civilized people. But if you insist on doing this the hard way, my men and I are prepared to accommodate you." The captain made a small hand signal, and his 5 companions shifted their positions slightly. To Sarah, it didn't look like much, but she could see the effect it had on the bikers. Several of them took involuntary steps backward, and she heard more whispered conversations among the group. The biker leader was beginning to realize that he had made a serious mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You think you can intimidate us with your fancy military training? We've been fighting since before you were born, boy." "I'm sure you have," Captain Rodriguez replied calmly, "and I respect that. But there's a difference between fighting and what my men and I do. We don't fight fair, and we don't fight for fun. When we fight, it's to win, quickly and permanently." The rain was coming down steadily now, and the wind was strong enough to make the motorcycles rock on their stands. Sarah could see that everyone was getting soaked, but no one seemed willing to be the first to move. "Last chance," Captain Rodriguez said. "Mount up and ride away, or we'll help you make that decision." The biker leader's hand moved toward something under his jacket, and everything changed in an instant. The moment the biker leader's hand moved toward his jacket, the 6 Delta Force operators responded with the lightning speed that came from years of training in the world's most dangerous places. Captain Rodriguez didn't need to give any verbal commands. His team had worked together for so long that they could read each other's intentions like a well-rehearsed dance. Sergeant First Class Mike Torres, positioned to the captain's left, moved first. In one fluid motion, he closed the 20-foot gap between himself and the biker leader before the man could draw whatever weapon he was reaching for. Torres had learned hand-to-hand combat from masters in 3 different countries, and he applied that knowledge now with surgical precision. The biker leader found himself face down in the mud before he even realized what had happened. His arm was pinned behind his back at an angle that made it clear that any movement would result in a broken shoulder. The weapon he had been reaching for, a large knife, lay in the mud 3 feet away from his outstretched fingers. The other bikers started to move forward to help their leader, but they quickly discovered that they had their own problems to deal with. Staff Sergeant David Kim had somehow appeared behind 3 of the largest bikers without any of them noticing his approach. His Korean-American parents had sent him to Taekwondo classes as a child to build confidence, and the United States Army had turned him into something far more dangerous than anyone in his hometown could have imagined. 2 of the bikers found themselves on the ground before they could react, while the third stood frozen as Kim held a pressure point on his neck that made any movement extremely painful. "I wouldn't recommend trying anything," Kim said quietly. "This particular technique can cause permanent nerve damage if I apply just a little more pressure." Specialist Marcus Johnson, the youngest member of the Delta Force team at 26, was dealing with 4 bikers who had surrounded him near the motorcycles. Johnson had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, where learning to fight wasn't optional, but the military had taught him that fighting wasn't about anger or aggression. It was about efficiency and control. The first biker swung a chain at Johnson's head, but the soldier caught the man's wrist and used his own momentum against him. The biker found himself flipping through the air and landing hard on his back next to his motorcycle. The second attacker fared no better, as Johnson used a technique he had learned from Israeli Krav Maga instructors to disable him with minimal effort. The third and fourth bikers looked at their fallen companions and decided that discretion might be the better part of valor. They backed away slowly, their hands raised to show they weren't reaching for weapons. Master Sergeant Robert Thompson was dealing with the largest concentration of bikers near Sarah's truck. Thompson was the oldest member of the team at 38, and he had seen combat in more countries than most people could name. He had learned that the key to handling multiple opponents was to prevent them from coordinating their attacks. Thompson grabbed the first biker's jacket and used him as a shield while he dealt with the others. A quick elbow strike to a pressure point caused the human shield to go limp, and Thompson let him slide to the ground before turning his attention to the remaining threats. His movements were economical and precise, each strike calculated to disable rather than cause permanent harm. Staff Sergeant Luis Chavez had positioned himself to deal with any bikers who might try to escape on their motorcycles. Chavez had grown up in New Mexico, where he had learned to ride horses before he could properly walk. The Army had taught him to drive everything from tanks to helicopters, but his real specialty was making sure that bad guys couldn't run away when things went wrong for them. Chavez had quietly disabled several of the motorcycles while the confrontation was building. A few strategic cuts to fuel lines and removed spark plug wires would ensure that anyone trying to make a quick getaway would find themselves walking instead of riding. The 6th member of the team, Technical Sergeant Angela Washington, was maintaining overwatch from a position near their vehicles. Washington was one of only a handful of women ever selected for Delta Force, and she had earned her place through exceptional skill rather than any kind of special consideration. Her job was to watch for additional threats and to coordinate with local law enforcement if the situation escalated further. Washington spoke quietly into her radio headset, contacting the local sheriff's department to let them know what was happening. She also kept watch on the surrounding area, making sure that no additional bikers were approaching from other directions. Sarah watched in amazement as the 6 soldiers dealt with 35 bikers with what looked like supernatural efficiency. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, and not a single shot had been fired. The soldiers moved with a coordination and precision that made it clear they had done this kind of thing many times before. The rain was falling harder now, turning the dirt road into mud and making visibility poor. Lightning continued to flash overhead, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the ground. But despite the worsening weather, none of the soldiers seemed hurried or stressed by the situation. Captain Rodriguez walked over to the biker leader, who was still face down in the mud under Sergeant Torres's control. "Sir," the captain said politely, "I hope you're beginning to understand that this situation isn't going to end the way you originally planned." The biker leader tried to lift his head to respond, but Torres applied just enough pressure to keep him in place. "You're making a mistake, soldier," the leader said, his voice muffled by the mud. "We have friends in this area, important friends. People who won't appreciate you interfering with our business." Captain Rodriguez crouched down next to the man's head. "I'm sure you do have friends, sir. But I need you to understand something about my men and me. We've dealt with drug cartels in Colombia, terrorist cells in Afghanistan, and human traffickers in Southeast Asia. Local corruption doesn't really worry us very much." The captain stood up and looked around at the other bikers, most of whom were now sitting or lying in the mud under the watchful eyes of his team. "Here's what's going to happen next," he announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear despite the rain and wind. "The young lady is going to drive safely back to her farm. The rest of you are going to get back on your motorcycles and leave this county immediately." One of the bikers, who hadn't been directly involved in the fighting, found the courage to speak up. "And what if we don't want to leave? This is still a free country, last I checked." Sergeant Washington answered from her position near the military vehicles. "Actually, sir, freedom comes with responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is respecting other people's rights. When you surround someone's vehicle and threaten them with weapons, you're violating their rights." She gestured toward Sarah's truck. "That young lady has the right to travel on public roads without being harassed or threatened. She has the right to feel safe on her own property. Your freedom doesn't include the right to take away someone else's freedom." The biker who had spoken looked around at his fallen companions and seemed to realize that philosophical discussions about freedom weren't going to improve his situation. Several other bikers were beginning to look nervous, and Sarah could hear some of them whispering among themselves about whether they should have listened to their leader in the first place. Master Sergeant Thompson approached the group of bikers he had been dealing with. "Gentlemen, I want you to understand something. My team and I don't want to hurt anyone today. We're not looking for a fight, and we're not trying to prove anything. All we want is for everyone to go home safely." He gestured toward the storm clouds overhead. "This weather is getting worse, and sitting around in the rain arguing isn't helping anyone. Why don't you make the smart choice and head back to wherever you came from? Find a warm, dry place to wait out the storm and forget this ever happened." One of the younger bikers raised his head from the mud where Johnson had put him. "What if we don't want to forget? What if we decide to come back later and finish what we started?" Specialist Johnson looked down at the young man with something that might have been pity. "Son, I've been in this business for 8 years, and I've learned something important. There's always someone tougher than you are. Always someone faster, smarter, and better trained. The smart ones figure that out before they get hurt. The dumb ones have to learn it the hard way." Johnson gestured toward his teammates. "You just tried to intimidate 6 of the most highly trained soldiers in the world. We've fought in places where the enemy had more training, better equipment, and home field advantage. And we won those fights because we work as a team. We stay calm under pressure, and we never give up." He crouched down next to the young biker. "So if you want to come back later and try again, that's your choice. But I guarantee you that it will end the same way it ended today, except next time we might not be in such a good mood." Captain Rodriguez walked over to Sarah's truck and tapped gently on the window. She rolled it down, and he could see that she was shaking, though whether from fear or adrenaline, it was hard to tell. "Ma'am, are you injured in any way?" he asked, his voice gentle, despite the intensity of what had just happened. Sarah shook her head. "No, I'm fine, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." "You don't need to worry about that now," Rodriguez replied. "Is your truck running? Are you able to drive back to your farm safely?" Sarah tried the ignition, and for once the old Ford started immediately. "Yes, it's working. But what about them?" She gestured toward the bikers. "We'll make sure they leave the area," the captain assured her. "But I want you to do something for me. When you get home, I want you to call the sheriff's department and report what happened here. Give them as much detail as you can remember. If these men are traveling around threatening people, the local authorities need to know about it." Sarah nodded. "I will. Thank you again. I don't even know how to repay you for what you did." Captain Rodriguez smiled, and this time it was a genuine expression of warmth. "Ma'am, no payment is necessary. Protecting innocent people is what we signed up for. It's not just our job, it's our honor." He stepped back from the truck. "Now, I want you to drive straight home and lock your doors. Don't stop for anyone or anything. If you have any more problems, call 911 immediately." Sarah nodded and put the truck in gear. As she drove away, she looked in her rearview mirror and saw the 6 soldiers still standing guard over the subdued bikers. Even through the rain and fading light, she could see that they remained alert and ready, professional to the end. The storm was getting worse, with lightning flashing almost continuously and thunder following immediately after. The wind was strong enough now to bend the smaller trees along the roadside, and Sarah had to fight to keep the old truck on the road. Back at the confrontation site, Captain Rodriguez was addressing the biker leader, who was now sitting up in the mud under Torres's watchful eye. "Sir, my men are going to release you and your friends now. I want you to mount up and head back the way you came. I don't want to see any of you in this county again." The biker leader wiped mud from his face and glared at the captain. "This isn't over, soldier boy. We know people. Important people." Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "You know, sir, you keep mentioning these important friends of yours. That tells me that you're probably involved in activities that go well beyond simple harassment. Drug trafficking, maybe? Human trafficking?" The captain's expression became very serious. "If that's the case, then you should know that my team and I specialize in hunting down people exactly like you. We're very good at it, and we don't give up easily. So if you are involved in those kinds of activities, I'd strongly recommend finding a new line of work." Several of the bikers looked distinctly uncomfortable at this suggestion, and Sarah could see that the captain's words had hit close to home for at least some of them. Sergeant Torres helped the leader to his feet but stayed close enough to take him down again if necessary. One by one, the other soldiers released their captives, but they maintained a defensive formation that made it clear the situation was still under their control. The bikers began moving toward their motorcycles, many of them limping or nursing injuries from their brief encounter with the Delta Force team. Several discovered that their bikes had been sabotaged and began arguing among themselves about who was going to ride double and who was going to be left behind. "Mechanical difficulties?" Captain Rodriguez asked innocently. Sergeant Chavez shrugged. "Sometimes these older bikes just break down when you need them most. It's really unfortunate." The rain was falling so hard now that it was difficult to see more than a few yards in any direction. The bikers who still had working motorcycles fired up their engines, while those with disabled bikes climbed on behind their companions. The sound of the engines was almost lost in the noise of the storm. As the motorcycles began to move out, heading back toward the main highway, Captain Rodriguez called out one final warning. "Remember, gentlemen, we'll be keeping an eye on this area for the next few days. If any harm comes to that young lady or her property, we'll know exactly where to look for the people responsible." The last of the motorcycles disappeared into the storm, leaving the 6 soldiers alone on the muddy road. They stood in the rain for several minutes, making sure that none of the bikers decided to double back, before finally returning to their vehicles. As they drove away in the opposite direction from the retreating bikers, Captain Rodriguez couldn't help but think about the young woman they had helped. She had shown real courage in the face of a terrifying situation, and he hoped that she would be able to continue living peacefully on her family's farm. Behind them, the storm continued to build, as if nature itself was washing away any trace of the violence that had almost occurred on this lonely stretch of Texas road. Sarah Martinez drove through the storm with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The old truck's windshield wipers struggled against the torrential rain, and every flash of lightning illuminated the familiar landscape of her farm in stark, dramatic detail. She couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened back on the road, and what certainly would have happened if those 6 soldiers hadn't appeared when they did. When she finally reached her farmhouse, Sarah sat in the truck for several minutes, letting the engine run while she tried to process everything that had occurred. The house looked exactly the same as it had when she left that morning, but somehow everything felt different now. The sense of safety and isolation that she had always treasured about this place had been shattered by the realization of how vulnerable she really was. Sarah finally turned off the engine and made a run for the front porch, getting soaked in the few seconds it took to reach the shelter of the roof. She fumbled with her keys for a moment before getting the door open and stepping into the warmth and safety of her childhood home. The first thing she did was call the sheriff's department, as Captain Rodriguez had instructed. The dispatcher who answered seemed skeptical at first when Sarah described what had happened, but became much more attentive when she mentioned the involvement of Delta Force soldiers. "Ma'am, can you hold the line for just a moment?" the dispatcher asked. "I need to speak with Sheriff Morrison about this." Sarah waited, listening to the storm rage outside, while she stood in her kitchen holding the phone. Through the window, she could see the barn where she had been planning to store the hay that was still sitting in the back of her truck, getting soaked by the rain. "Ms. Martinez, this is Sheriff Morrison." The voice that came on the line was deep and authoritative. "I understand you had some trouble with a motorcycle gang today?" Sarah told him everything she could remember, from the moment she first spotted the dust cloud on the horizon to when the soldiers had assured her safety and sent her home. Sheriff Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously," the sheriff said when she finished her account. "We've had reports of this same group causing trouble in 3 other counties over the past week. So far, you're the first person who managed to avoid being robbed or worse." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "What happened to the others?" "Let's just say you were very fortunate that those soldiers showed up when they did," Sheriff Morrison replied grimly. "I'm going to send a deputy out to your place to take a formal statement and to check on your security situation. In the meantime, I want you to keep your doors locked and call 911 immediately if you see or hear anything suspicious." After hanging up with the sheriff, Sarah made herself a cup of coffee and sat at her kitchen table, trying to process the day's events. The coffee was hot and comforting, but she found that her hands were still shaking slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips. 20 miles away, Captain Rodriguez and his team were setting up a temporary camp in an abandoned barn that they had spotted from the road. The structure was old but solid, and it would provide shelter from the storm while they waited to see if the bikers would be foolish enough to return. "Think they'll come back?" Sergeant Torres asked, as he checked his equipment for the 3rd time since they had stopped. "The smart ones won't," Captain Rodriguez replied, "but there's always a few in every group who think they have something to prove." The leader struck me as the type who doesn't like being embarrassed in front of his followers. Master Sergeant Thompson was monitoring radio communications from local law enforcement. "Sheriff's Department is taking the situation seriously," he reported. "Apparently, this isn't the first time this group has caused problems in the area." Captain Rodriguez nodded. "I was afraid of that. Groups like this don't usually stop with one incident. They keep pushing until someone pushes back hard enough to make them reconsider their life choices." Specialist Johnson was cleaning his sidearm, though it hadn't been drawn during the confrontation. "Sir, what's our legal authority here? We're not law enforcement, and this isn't a military operation." "Legally, we're just citizens who happen to be in the right place at the right time," Rodriguez explained. "But we all took an oath to defend this country and its people against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sometimes the line between military service and civic duty gets a little blurred." Staff Sergeant Kim was studying maps of the local area on his tablet. "If they do come back, there are 3 main routes they could use to reach the farm. The highway we saw them on, a back road that runs along the creek, and an old logging trail that comes in from the north." "Good thinking," Rodriguez said. "Let's position ourselves so we can monitor all 3 approaches. If they show up, I want to know about it before they get anywhere near that young woman." Technical Sergeant Washington was monitoring communications from a broader area, using equipment that could pick up radio chatter from hundreds of miles away. "Sir, I'm picking up some interesting conversations. Sounds like our friends are regrouping about 40 miles south of here. They're not happy about what happened today." Rodriguez moved over to listen to the intercepted communications. The voices were distorted by static and the storm, but the content was clear enough. The bikers were planning to return to Sarah's farm that night, this time with reinforcements and better weapons. "How many more are they talking about?" Rodriguez asked. Washington adjusted the frequency on her radio. "Sounds like they're calling in members from at least 2 other chapters. Could be looking at 60 to 70 riders by the time they're done." Sergeant Chavez whistled low. "That's a lot of motorcycles." "Even for us." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, considering their options. "The local sheriff's department won't be able to handle numbers like that, especially if they're as well armed as they claim to be. We need to find a way to end this before it escalates into something that could hurt innocent people." Back at the farm, Sarah had finished giving her statement to Deputy Williams, a young officer who had arrived just as the worst of the storm was passing through. The deputy had been thorough and professional, but Sarah could tell that he was concerned about her safety. "Ms. Martinez, I have to be honest with you," Deputy Williams said as he prepared to leave. "Our department has been tracking this gang for several weeks now. They're not just common criminals. We have reason to believe they're involved in drug trafficking and possibly human trafficking as well." Sarah felt another wave of fear wash over her. "What does that mean for me?" "It means they have a lot to lose if you can identify them in court," the deputy explained. "People like that don't usually just walk away when witnesses can testify against them." The deputy handed her his business card. "I'm going to park at the end of your driveway for the rest of the night. Sheriff Morrison is also requesting additional patrols in this area. But Ms. Martinez, if these people are determined to come back, I'm not sure we can guarantee your safety with the resources we have available." After the deputy left, Sarah found herself alone in the house where she had grown up, listening to every sound the old building made as it settled in the cooling air after the storm, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the eaves, made her jump. At 11 o'clock that night, Captain Rodriguez's radio crackled to life with Washington's voice. "Sir, we've got movement on the highway. Large group of motorcycles heading this way." Rodriguez keyed his microphone. "How many?" "I count at least 50, possibly more. They're moving in formation, and they're armed. This isn't a social visit." Rodriguez felt a familiar sensation, the calm focus that always came over him before a difficult mission. "All right, people, this is what we've been waiting for. Remember, our primary objective is to protect the civilian. Everything else is secondary." The 6 Delta Force operators moved out into the night, using night vision equipment and years of training to position themselves along the routes leading to Sarah's farm. They were outnumbered more than 8 to 1, but numbers had never been the determining factor in the battles they fought. Sarah was trying to sleep when she heard the sound of motorcycles in the distance. At first, she thought she might be imagining it, but the sound grew steadily louder and more distinct. She grabbed the rifle her father had taught her to use and crept to the front window, peering out into the darkness. The moon had come out after the storm passed, casting everything in silvery light that made the landscape look alien and threatening. Sarah could see the deputy's patrol car parked at the end of her driveway, but there was no sign of movement from the vehicle. The sound of the motorcycles was getting closer, and now Sarah could see lights in the distance, dozens of them, moving toward her farm like a swarm of mechanical fireflies. Her heart began to race as she realized that the bikers had returned in much larger numbers. Sarah reached for the phone to call 911, but before she could dial, the line went dead. She tried her cell phone, but there was no signal. Someone had apparently cut the phone lines and was jamming cellular communications in the area. Outside, Captain Rodriguez and his team watched as the motorcycle convoy approached Sarah's farm. They could see that the bikers had learned from their earlier encounter and were approaching more cautiously this time. The group split into 3 columns, with each taking one of the routes that Sergeant Kim had identified. "They're trying to surround the house," Torres reported over the radio. "Looks like they learned some tactics since this afternoon." "Understood," Rodriguez replied. "Remember, we need to keep them away from the house without putting the civilian at risk. Use precision fire only, and watch your backgrounds." The first shots of the night came from Staff Sergeant Kim, who had positioned himself to cover the Creek Road approach. His rifle spoke twice in quick succession, and 2 motorcycle tires exploded, sending their riders tumbling into the muddy ditch beside the road. Specialist Johnson was covering the logging trail approach when 15 motorcycles emerged from the tree line. His first shot disabled the lead motorcycle's engine, causing it to coast to a stop and block the trail for the riders behind it. "This is Johnson," he reported calmly. "I've got a traffic jam on the north approach. They're going to have to find another way around." Master Sergeant Thompson was dealing with the largest group, which was advancing up the main highway. His position gave him a clear field of fire, but there were too many targets for him to handle alone. "Rodriguez, this is Thompson. I've got at least 30 riders on the main approach. I can slow them down, but I can't stop them all." "Help is on the way," Rodriguez replied, and Thompson could hear the captain's rifle joining the fight. The bikers quickly realized that they were facing a much more organized defense than they had expected. Several of them tried to return fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows, while the Delta Force operators were using night vision equipment to pick their targets with surgical precision. Sergeant Chavez had positioned himself near the farm buildings, ready to provide close protection for Sarah if any of the attackers managed to get through the outer perimeter. From his position, he could see her silhouette in the window of the farmhouse, and he keyed his radio. "Ma'am, this is Sergeant Chavez with the U.S. Army. Can you hear me?" Sarah nearly jumped out of her skin when the voice came from seemingly nowhere. "Who's there? Where are you?" "I'm positioned outside your house to provide protection. The men who threatened you today have returned with reinforcements, but my team is dealing with them. I need you to stay away from the windows and get down on the floor." Sarah did as instructed, lying flat on her living room floor while the sound of gunfire echoed across her property. She could hear motorcycles revving and men shouting, but she couldn't tell what was happening. The battle lasted for nearly an hour, with the Delta Force operators systematically dismantling the biker gang's assault. They used tactics learned in conflicts around the world, turning the bikers' superior numbers against them by forcing them to bunch up in areas where they could be easily targeted. Finally, the surviving bikers began to retreat, their confidence shattered by the realization that they were facing opponents far beyond their ability to handle. Many of them abandoned their motorcycles entirely, fleeing on foot into the night. When the shooting stopped, Captain Rodriguez conducted a quick head count of his team. Everyone was accounted for and uninjured. The bikers had not been as fortunate, with more than 20 of them requiring medical attention and the rest in full retreat. Sheriff Morrison arrived 30 minutes later with every available deputy and 2 ambulances. He found the Delta Force team providing first aid to the wounded bikers, while Captain Rodriguez coordinated with local law enforcement to process the crime scene. Captain Rodriguez, I'm Sheriff Morrison. I understand we owe you and your men a debt of gratitude. Rodriguez shook the sheriff's hand. Just doing our job, Sheriff. Though I think you'll find that most of these men will be facing federal charges related to organized crime activities. The sheriff nodded grimly. We've been building a case against this organization for months. Tonight's events should give us everything we need to shut them down permanently. As the sun rose over Sarah's farm, she finally felt safe enough to come outside. The yard was littered with abandoned motorcycles and other evidence of the night's battle, but her house and buildings were undamaged. Captain Rodriguez approached her as she stood on her front porch, taking in the scene. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Sarah nodded, though she was still shaking slightly. "I can't believe this really happened. I feel like I'm living in a movie or something." "I'm sorry you had to experience this," Rodriguez said sincerely. "But you should know that you showed real courage tonight. A lot of people would have panicked in your situation." Sarah looked around at the evidence of the battle. "What happens now? The ones we captured will be going to federal prison for a very long time," Rodriguez explained. "The few who escaped won't be coming back. They'll be too busy trying to stay ahead of every law enforcement agency in the country." He gestured toward his team, who were packing up their equipment. "My men and I will be moving on today. Our unit isn't supposed to be involved in domestic law enforcement, so our presence here will have to remain unofficial." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Will I ever see you again?" Captain Rodriguez smiled. "Ma'am, I hope you never need to see people like us again. But if you ever do, we'll be there." As the Delta Force team drove away from Sarah's farm, she stood on her porch watching until their vehicles disappeared over the hill. The nightmare was over, and she could begin the process of rebuilding her sense of security and peace. But she would never forget the 6 soldiers who had appeared out of nowhere to protect a stranger, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of having done their duty. In a world that often seemed filled with darkness and violence, they had reminded her that there were still people willing to stand between innocent civilians and those who would do them harm. Sarah Martinez returned to her daily routine of running the family farm, but she carried with her the knowledge that somewhere out there, quiet professionals were standing guard, ready to respond when good people needed protection from those who chose to live outside the law.